Map. HOA Karen's SUV crossed my farm every day, destroying my land and ignoring my rights. I stayed silent, gathered evidence, and prepared a smart response that would expose her abuse of power forever. Welcome back, everyone. Before today's story begins, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story is released. Your support means more than you know. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing incredible stories with viewers around the world. And before we begin, tell me this: where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The first sound that woke me up every morning wasn't my alarm clock. It was the sound of someone else's vehicle destroying something my family spent generations protecting. The engine came before the damage. A deep mechanical roar cutting through the quiet Colorado morning. The crunch of gravel. The heavy tires pressing into soft ground. The unmistakable sound of something crossing a line that was never meant to be crossed. I stepped outside my farmhouse with a mug of coffee in my hand, expecting another ordinary day. Instead, I saw fresh tracks. 2 dark lines carved across my field. My name is Caleb Mitchell, and this farm has been part of my family for decades. My grandfather built the original barn with materials he carried himself. My father repaired every fence post after every harsh winter. And I spent my life maintaining the land they trusted me to protect. This place was never just dirt. It was history. It was hard work. It was home. But for the past few weeks, one person had decided that my property was simply an obstacle in her way. Victoria Caldwell, president of Silver Creek Meadows HOA. And every morning, like clockwork, her black SUV crossed my land. The first time it happened, I thought there had been some kind of mistake. Maybe she took a wrong turn. Maybe someone gave her incorrect information. But mistakes usually happen once, not every single day. That morning, I followed the tire marks until I reached the far side of my property. A section of grass was flattened, and part of my old fence had been pushed aside. Then I saw her SUV parked near the boundary. Victoria stepped out wearing a perfectly pressed jacket, holding a folder against her side like she was arriving at an important business meeting. She looked at the damaged ground. Then she looked at me. "Caleb," she said calmly, "I was hoping we could avoid making this complicated." I looked around. The only person making things complicated was the one standing on my land without permission. "What exactly do you think is happening here?" I asked. Victoria smiled. "The community needs better access." There it was, the phrase I would hear again and again. The community. She explained that the HOA was improving transportation routes and that my property happened to provide the easiest path. I pointed toward the fence. "This is private property." She didn't seem bothered. "Sometimes homeowners need to make reasonable compromises." I stared at her. A compromise requires both people agreeing, not one person deciding what belongs to someone else. I asked her where the authorization was. The document allowing the HOA to use my land. For the first time, her confidence slowed. Only for a second. "I'm sure the details have already been handled." That answer told me everything. People with proof usually show it. People without proof usually avoid the question. Victoria returned to her SUV and drove away, leaving another trail behind her. I stood there watching the dust disappear. I could have followed her. I could have called the HOA office. I could have started an argument right there in the field. But something stopped me. Years of working with machines taught me something important. When something keeps breaking, you don't just hit it harder. You find the cause. That afternoon, I walked into my workshop and pulled out an old notebook. I wrote down the date, the time, the damage, everything I remembered. Then I installed a camera facing the entrance of my property. I wasn't trying to start a war. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was creating a record. Because Victoria Caldwell believed my silence meant I was willing to accept it. She believed a quiet farmer would simply step aside. But she misunderstood something. Quiet people are not always powerless. Sometimes they are just preparing. And every tire mark her SUV left behind was becoming proof she never realized she was creating. The second week I watched Victoria Caldwell drive across my farm, I stopped seeing those tire marks as damage. I started seeing them as evidence. After installing the camera near the entrance of my property, my mornings changed. Before that, I would wake up wondering what I would find. A damaged patch of grass, a broken fence board, another reminder that someone believed my boundaries were optional. But now, I had something different. Proof. Every morning before starting my work, I walked into my workshop, turned on the monitor, and reviewed the recordings. The room smelled like old wood and machine oil. The same tools my father used decades ago hung on the walls around me. It was quiet, almost peaceful, until the footage appeared. 6:40 a.m. black SUV. Victoria Caldwell. Same entrance. Same path. Same decision. She wasn't making a mistake. She was following a routine. And that changed everything. A mistake happens once. A choice happens repeatedly. I wrote every detail down in my notebook. The date, the time, the location, the damage. I treated it like any other problem on the farm. I didn't guess. I didn't assume. I recorded. A few days later, another envelope arrived in my mailbox. The Silver Creek Meadows HOA logo was printed across the front. I already knew it wouldn't be good news. Inside was a formal notice. The letter claimed I was interfering with community access improvements. I read that sentence several times. Community access improvements. That was Victoria's favorite phrase. She used it because it made everything sound reasonable. It made taking something feel like helping someone. But there was one question the letter never answered. Who gave her permission? I placed the notice on my workbench next to my notebook. Then I looked through the camera recordings again. The answer was becoming clearer. Victoria wasn't trying to solve a problem. She was trying to make everyone accept her decision before anyone questioned it. That afternoon, I called someone I trusted. His name was Daniel Harper. Daniel had worked with property surveys for years and understood how land boundaries were documented. I didn't ask him to take my side. I asked him to look at the facts. 2 days later, Daniel arrived at the farm carrying a folder. We walked along the edge of the field where the SUV had been crossing. The wind moved through the grass while he compared the physical boundary with the official records. After several minutes, he stopped. "Caleb, this isn't a shared access route." I looked at him. "What does that mean?" He pointed toward the tire marks. "It means this vehicle has been crossing private property." Those words confirmed what I already knew. But hearing them from someone who understood property law made the situation real. Daniel opened the folder. "There's no easement here. No agreement. No recorded permission." I looked back toward the road. For weeks, Victoria acted like authority came from her position. But the documents showed something different. Her power existed only because people allowed themselves to believe it did. That evening, I organized everything again. The videos, the HOA notices, the property records, the photographs, each piece connected to the next. I wasn't building an argument. I was building a timeline. And timelines don't depend on opinions. They show what happened. The next morning, Victoria's SUV appeared again. I watched from my workshop window as it approached the entrance. She slowed down. For a moment, I thought maybe she had finally understood. Maybe she would turn around. But she didn't. She drove forward. Another set of tire marks appeared across my land. Another entry in my notebook. Another piece of evidence. And that was when I realized something. Victoria Caldwell wasn't just ignoring my warnings. She was creating the exact record that would eventually prove why she was wrong. The day I realized Victoria Caldwell wasn't confused, I stopped trying to explain my rights to her. I started preparing for the moment she would have to face the consequences of ignoring them. After confirming the property records, I thought Victoria might finally step back. I was wrong. People like Victoria don't change because they discover they made a mistake. They change when they realize their confidence cannot protect them anymore. A few days after Daniel's visit, I received another message from the HOA office. This time, it wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. Victoria wanted a meeting. She described it as an opportunity to find a solution. I read the message while sitting at my kitchen table, the same place where I had organized weeks of evidence. The wording was polite, professional, almost friendly. But I had learned to pay attention to what people do, not just what they say. For weeks, Victoria drove across my farm without permission. She ignored the signs. She ignored the questions. She ignored the documents. Now she wanted a conversation because the situation was no longer going the way she expected. I agreed to meet. The HOA office was exactly how I imagined it would be. Clean, modern, carefully designed to make every decision feel official. Victoria was waiting inside the conference room with several documents spread across the table. She smiled when I walked in. "Caleb, I'm glad you came. I really want to put this behind us. I sat down and placed my notebook beside me. I want the same thing. She looked relieved. Until I continued. I wanted to stop. Her expression changed slightly. Only for a moment. But I noticed. Victoria opened her folder and began explaining how the community needed better access. She talked about convenience. She talked about homeowners. She talked about progress. But every explanation avoided the same question. Where was the permission? I listened quietly. Then I asked, "Can you show me the agreement that allows the HOA to use my property?" The room became silent. Victoria looked at the papers in front of her. "We believe this access benefits everyone." I nodded. But that wasn't my question. That was the first time I saw her confidence weaken. Because she had an answer for opinions. She had an answer for complaints. But she didn't have an answer for facts. After the meeting, I went straight to the county records office. The building was quiet, filled with the smell of old documents and decades of history. I requested every record connected to my property boundaries. The clerk returned with a thick folder. Inside were years of information. Maps, surveys, legal descriptions, everything that showed exactly where my land began and ended. I studied each page carefully. Then I found it. There was no shared access agreement, no recorded easement, no permission, nothing. The path Victoria used every morning existed only because she decided it should. I sat there holding those documents and thought about something important. Victoria never won because she had the law on her side. She won because nobody had challenged her before. That was the mistake she made. She assumed silence meant acceptance. She assumed patience meant weakness. She assumed I was someone who would eventually give up. But farmers learn something early. You don't abandon a field because a storm arrives. You protect it. You repair it. You wait. And you prepare. That evening, I returned home and placed the county records beside my camera footage. For the first time, everything was connected. The damage, the warnings, the repeated crossings, the missing permission. The entire story was sitting in front of me. Victoria believed she was creating a shortcut through my farm. She didn't realize she was creating a path toward her own downfall. The biggest mistake Victoria Caldwell made was believing I was trying to fight her. She never realized I was doing something much more dangerous to someone like her. I was documenting everything. After I returned from the county records office, I stopped looking at my farm the same way. Before, I saw the tire tracks as damage. Now, I saw a pattern. Every mark across my field represented a decision Victoria made. Every broken section of grass represented another moment where she believed the rules did not apply to her. And the more I looked at the evidence, the clearer the picture became. This was never about convenience. It was about control. Victoria wanted everyone to believe that because she was the HOA president, she had the authority to decide what happened around Silver Creek Meadows. But authority without permission is just a title. And titles do not change property lines. Over the next several days, I focused on protecting my land. Not with anger, not with threats, with preparation. I upgraded the cameras around the entrance so they captured every angle of the driveway and the boundary area. I repaired the damaged fence section and added clear private property signs. The message was simple. No confusion, no misunderstanding, no excuse. I wanted Victoria to have every opportunity to stop. Because once someone knows the rules and chooses to ignore them, the responsibility belongs to them. A few mornings later, I saw her SUV approaching again. I was standing inside my workshop, watching the camera feed. The smell of oil and metal filled the room as I looked at the monitor. The vehicle slowed near the entrance. Victoria saw the signs. She saw the cameras. For a moment, everything stopped. I thought maybe she would finally turn around. Maybe she would realize the situation had changed. But then the SUV moved forward. The tires crossed onto my property again. I didn't feel angry. I felt certain. Because that moment gave me something more valuable than an argument. It gave me confirmation. Victoria wasn't unaware. She wasn't confused. She was choosing to continue. That evening, I saved the footage and added it to the growing file on my desk. The folder was getting thicker. Inside were weeks of evidence. The first recordings, the HOA notices, the property documents, the photographs, the warnings, everything connected. Everything told the same story. A story Victoria could no longer rewrite. A few days later, I spoke with Daniel again. He reviewed the newest footage and looked through the complete timeline. "You understand what you have here, right?" he asked. I looked at the folder. "I have proof." He nodded. "More than that. You have a pattern. That word stayed with me. Pattern. Because one mistake can be explained. One misunderstanding can be corrected. But a repeated choice tells a different story. Victoria had created a routine. She had created records. And she had created the exact evidence needed to show what was happening. That night, I sat outside near the edge of the field. The sun was setting behind the mountains. The same land that had caused so much frustration looked peaceful again. I thought about my grandfather building the first structures here. I thought about my father repairing the fences. They never had to deal with an HOA president driving through their property. But they understood something I understood too. Land is not protected by fences alone. It is protected by people who care enough to stand up for it. The next morning, another message arrived from Victoria. She wanted one more meeting. She called it a final opportunity to resolve the situation. I read the message carefully. Then I looked at the folder beside me. She still believed this was a negotiation. She still believed I was asking her to stop. But she didn't understand. I was no longer asking. I was preparing. And soon, Victoria Caldwell was going to learn that every step she took across my farm had brought her closer to the moment when the truth would finally catch up with her. The final warning was not meant to scare Victoria Caldwell. It was meant to give her one last chance to make the right choice before everything she built started falling apart. The morning after her message arrived, I walked across my farm before sunrise. The air was cold. The fields were quiet. For a moment, everything looked exactly the way it had before this started. But then I saw them. The tire marks. Those 2 lines cutting across the grass were a reminder that some problems do not disappear just because you ignore them. I stood there for a while, looking at the path Victoria's SUV had created. Weeks earlier, those tracks represented frustration. Now, they represented something else. A record. I returned to my workshop and opened the folder sitting on my desk. Inside were all the pieces of the story Victoria never wanted anyone to see. The first camera recordings, the property surveys, the HOA letters, the photographs, the warnings. Every document had a purpose. Every date connected to another. I wasn't preparing an emotional argument. I was preparing the truth. That afternoon, I made one final adjustment to the entrance of my property. I installed additional warning signs and updated the camera coverage around the boundary. Everything was clear. Everything was visible. There was no room for misunderstanding. I wanted Victoria to understand that things had changed. This was no longer a situation where she could simply drive away and pretend nothing happened. The next morning, I saw the black SUV approaching again. I was inside my workshop when the camera notification appeared. My hands were covered with grease from repairing equipment, but I stopped immediately and looked at the screen. There she was, Victoria Caldwell, driving toward the same entrance. For a few seconds, she remained in the vehicle. She looked at the signs. She looked around. She knew. That was the moment I understood something. The problem was never that Victoria didn't know the rules. The problem was that she believed the rules were for everyone else. Then the SUV moved forward. The tires crossed the boundary. The cameras recorded everything. The time, the location, the vehicle, the driver, the choice. Later that day, I saved the footage and added it to the folder. Another piece. Another confirmation. Another decision she would have to explain. That evening, I met with Daniel again. We sat at my kitchen table surrounded by documents and recordings. He reviewed the newest evidence carefully. After several minutes, he leaned back. "Caleb, this is exactly what you needed." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" "You gave her warnings. You gave her opportunities. You documented everything. Now nobody can say she didn't know." Those words mattered. Because that was the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge is about making someone suffer. Justice is about making sure the truth cannot be ignored. And I wanted the second one. A few days later, Victoria sent another message. This time, her tone was different. She wanted a final meeting. She said she wanted to resolve the conflict before things became unnecessary. I read that sentence several times. Unnecessary. That was an interesting choice of words. Because from my perspective, the only unnecessary thing was someone repeatedly crossing land that did not belong to them. I looked at the folder beside me. Then I looked outside toward the field. The same field my family had protected for generations. I knew what would happen next. Victoria still believed she was calling me into a negotiation. She still believed she had the advantage. But she didn't understand something important. The meeting was never going to be about whether I would give up my land. It was going to be about proving why I never should have been asked to. And when the truth finally reached everyone, Victoria Caldwell would discover that the person she underestimated the most was the person who had been paying attention the entire time. Victoria Caldwell thought the final meeting would be the moment she convinced me to step aside. She didn't realize it would be the moment everyone finally understood who had been telling the truth. The HOA conference room felt different when I walked in. The first time I sat there, Victoria controlled every conversation. She had the title. She had the confidence. She had people listening before they even knew the full story. But this time, I carried something different. Not anger. Not frustration. Evidence. Victoria was already sitting at the table with several HOA members around her. She smiled when she saw me. "Caleb, I'm glad you decided to come. I think we can finally put this misunderstanding behind us." That word again. Misunderstanding. A word people use when they want to make a serious problem sound smaller than it is. I placed my folder on the table. I agree. I think everyone deserves to understand what actually happened. Her smile faded slightly. The meeting began with Victoria explaining the situation from her perspective. She talked about community needs. She talked about improving access. She talked about cooperation. But every sentence avoided the same important detail: the fact that she was using land that belonged to someone else. One HOA member asked a simple question. "Victoria, do we have written permission from Caleb to use that route?" The room became quiet. She looked toward her documents. "We believe this was the best solution for the community." Again, not an answer, just another explanation. I opened my folder. Inside were the property records, the camera recordings, and the timeline I had created. I didn't throw the papers onto the table. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply showed the information. The first video played on the screen. Victoria's SUV entering my property. The second video showed the same thing. A different day, a different morning, the same action. The room became silent. Not because people were confused, because they understood. The pattern was clear. Every time Victoria crossed my land, she believed she was proving she had authority. Instead, she was proving she had ignored the boundaries. She tried to interrupt. "Caleb, you're making this look much worse than it is." I looked at her calmly. "No, I'm showing exactly what happened." That was the moment the atmosphere changed. Because facts do not need confidence. They do not need a title. They do not need approval. They simply exist. After the meeting, several residents stayed behind. Some asked questions. Some apologized. One neighbor admitted they always assumed Victoria had permission because she spoke with so much certainty. That was the part that surprised people the most. Not the SUV. Not the tire tracks. The confidence. Victoria had convinced people that sounding powerful was the same as being right. But those are two completely different things. Later that evening, I returned home and walked across the field. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting a golden light over the same land where this entire conflict began. I looked at the grass, the fence, the entrance, everything that had changed. For weeks, Victoria believed she was fighting a farmer who refused to cooperate. She never understood that I wasn't fighting her. I was protecting something that mattered. That night, I received a message from the HOA board. They wanted to review previous decisions made under Victoria's leadership. They wanted more transparency. They wanted answers. I read the message quietly, because that was when I realized something important. The biggest mistake Victoria made wasn't driving across my farm. It was believing nobody would ever challenge her. She built her power on silence. But silence only works until someone decides to speak with the truth. And now everyone was listening. The moment Victoria Caldwell lost the support of the people around her was the moment she realized something terrifying. The story she controlled for so long was no longer hers to tell. After the HOA meeting, the atmosphere in Silver Creek Meadows changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but enough that everyone noticed. For weeks, Victoria had been the person everyone looked to for answers. She spoke first. She made decisions quickly. She presented every situation as if there was only one reasonable solution. Her confidence made people believe she knew what she was doing. But confidence can hide mistakes. And once people started looking closer, they began seeing the things they had ignored. The question started. Why was the HOA using private property without written permission? Why were residents never shown the agreement? Why did Victoria continue after receiving warnings? Those questions became harder to avoid. A few days later, I received another call from Daniel. He told me several homeowners had requested copies of old HOA decisions. "They're reviewing everything now," he said. I looked out at my field. The same field where this entire conflict started. What changed? I asked. Daniel paused. People finally saw the difference between leadership and control. That sentence stayed with me. Because that was exactly the problem. Victoria didn't lose influence because she was confident. She lost influence because she confused authority with ownership. She believed holding a position meant she could decide what happened on someone else's property. But a title is only powerful when people trust the person carrying it. And trust disappears quickly when the truth appears. Over the next several weeks, the HOA began reviewing previous decisions. Residents attended meetings who had never attended before. People asked questions instead of simply accepting answers. They wanted transparency. They wanted explanations. They wanted to know how many other decisions had been made without proper discussion. For Victoria, that was the hardest part. It wasn't losing one argument with me. It was realizing that one person standing up had encouraged others to do the same. One evening, Frank Lawson, one of my neighbors, stopped by the farm. We stood near the fence line where Victoria's SUV had crossed so many times. He looked across the field. You know what the strange thing is, he said. I looked at him. What? Everyone thought you were fighting the HOA. He paused. But you were really just asking them to follow the same rules they expected everyone else to follow. I smiled slightly. Because that was the truth. I never wanted special treatment. I never wanted control. I wanted the same respect that every property owner deserves. That night, I walked through the field as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. The grass had started recovering. The fence had been repaired. The tire tracks that once cut across my land were fading. It was a small thing, but it meant something. The damage was disappearing. The lesson was staying. A few days later, the HOA held another meeting. This time, Victoria wasn't standing at the front of the room controlling the conversation. She was sitting among everyone else, listening, answering questions, explaining decisions that people were no longer willing to accept without proof. I watched quietly from the back, not because I wanted to see her embarrassed, because I wanted to see something different. Accountability. There is a difference between revenge and justice. Revenge is about watching someone fall. Justice is about making sure they understand why they fell. Victoria had spent months believing the problem was me. But the real problem was the belief that rules only applied when they were convenient. And now the entire community understood something she never expected. The quiet farmer she underestimated was not trying to defeat her. He was simply standing where he had always belonged, on his own land, defending what was his. The hardest part for Victoria Caldwell was not losing control of the HOA. It was realizing that the power she depended on was never really hers to begin with. After the community meeting, Silver Creek Meadows felt different. The same streets, the same houses, the same people. But something had changed. People were paying attention. For years, Victoria had built her reputation on being the person who always had the answer. When someone questioned a decision, she explained why it was necessary. When someone disagreed, she called it a misunderstanding. When someone pushed back, she called it a lack of cooperation. But now, people were asking questions before accepting answers. And that changed everything. The HOA began reviewing past decisions made during Victoria's leadership. Documents were requested. Meeting records were examined. Residents wanted to understand how certain choices had been made without their knowledge. I watched from a distance. Not because I didn't care. Because I had already done what I needed to do. I protected my land. Now the community had to decide what kind of leadership it wanted. A few weeks later, Daniel called me with an update. The board is considering new rules, he said. I was standing near the barn, looking across the field. What kind of rules? More transparency. More approvals. More accountability. I looked at the fence line. The same place where this entire situation started. It was interesting how something as simple as a tire track could reveal something much bigger. The problem was never just the SUV. The SUV was only the action everyone could see. The real problem was the belief behind it. The belief that a position gave someone permission to ignore boundaries. That belief was what had to change. One afternoon, Victoria came by the property. Not in her SUV. Not with paperwork. Not with a group of HOA members standing behind her. Just Victoria. She stopped near the entrance and looked toward the field. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she spoke. I didn't expect things to go this far. I looked at the repaired fence. I don't think you understood how far they had already gone. She stayed quiet. Because that was the truth. From her perspective, every decision was just another step toward what she wanted. But for mine, every step was another reminder that someone believed my property mattered less than their plans. That difference was the entire story. Victoria had seen my patience as weakness. She had mistaken calmness for surrender. But patience is not surrender. It is discipline. And sometimes discipline is what separates people who react from people who win. After she left, I walked the same path her SUV had taken so many times. The grass had started growing back. The damage was becoming harder to see. But I remembered it. Not because I wanted to hold on to anger. Because lessons are supposed to stay with you. My grandfather taught me something when I was young. You don't protect something because it is easy. You protect it because it matters. That lesson applied to more than a farm. It applied to rights, to fairness, to knowing when something is wrong and having the courage to stand up. Months later, Silver Creek Meadows had a different HOA. The meetings were more open. The decisions were discussed. People participated, not because they were forced to, because they finally understood their voices mattered. And my farm? It went back to being what it always was. A place of work. A place of memories. A place where my family's story continued. Sometimes I still think about that first morning. The sound of the engine. The tire tracks. The moment I realized someone believed they could take what wasn't theirs. But I also remember what happened afterward. I remember that the truth did not need to shout. It only needed time. Victoria thought she was driving across my land because nobody could stop her. She never realized every trip was bringing her closer to the moment when everyone would see exactly who was crossing the line. And in the end, my farm stayed mine. Not because I had more power, because I had something stronger. The truth. The last time I looked at the entrance of my farm, I didn't see tire tracks anymore. I saw the proof that patience can protect what anger never could. Months had passed since the morning Victoria Caldwell first drove her SUV across my land. Sometimes I think about how strange it is that such a simple decision created such a major change. A vehicle crossing a field. A fence being pushed aside. A person believing their position gave them permission. That was where everything started. At the beginning, Victoria thought this was about access. She thought it was about convenience. She thought I was just a farmer who didn't understand the needs of the community. But she was wrong. It was never about a road. It was about respect. Respect for boundaries. Respect for ownership. Respect for the idea that every person deserves to have their property protected. Today, my farm looks almost the same as it did before everything happened. The grass has grown back. The fence has been repaired. The mornings are quiet again. I wake up to the sound of the wind moving through the fields instead of the sound of an SUV engine cutting across my land. And that silence means more than people realize. Because peace feels different when you know you had to fight to keep it. A few weeks after the HOA changes, I walked past the entrance where Victoria's SUV used to enter. I stopped there for a moment. The same place where I once stood feeling frustrated and powerless now looked completely different. Not because the land changed. Because I changed. I learned that protecting something important does not always require being the loudest person in the room. Sometimes it requires being the most prepared. Victoria had more confidence. She had a title. She had influence. But I had something she underestimated. Time. Time to collect facts. Time to understand the situation. Time to let the truth speak for itself. That was the mistake she made. She believed my silence meant I was accepting what she was doing. She believed my calmness meant I was afraid. But silence is not always surrender. Sometimes silence is the moment before action. Sometimes the person standing quietly in the background is the person who already knows how the story will end. A year later, Silver Creek Meadows looked different too. The HOA meetings became more open. Residents asked more questions. Decisions were discussed instead of simply announced. People became more involved because they understood something important. A community does not become stronger when one person controls everything. It becomes stronger when everyone has a voice. I never wanted Victoria to lose everything. I never wanted revenge. What I wanted was simple. I wanted my property respected. I wanted my family's land protected. I wanted the same fairness that everyone expects for themselves. And in the end, that was what happened. Victoria didn't lose because I attacked her. She lost because she refused to listen. She didn't lose because I had more power. She lost because the truth had more weight than her position. Now, when I walk through my fields, I don't think about the conflict as much. I think about the lesson. A person can have a title. A person can have authority. A person can convince others to follow them. But none of that matters when their actions cannot stand against the facts. Victoria Caldwell believed she was driving across my farm because nobody could stop her. She never understood that every trip across my land was creating the evidence that would eventually stop her. And that is what I learned from the entire experience. Justice does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through patience, through preparation, through the simple decision to stand your ground. Because in the end, my farm stayed mine. Not because I fought harder, because I never stopped standing for what was right.